Hey there folks, the #1 Dax Riggs fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Dax Riggs record, 7 Songs for Spiders. Dax Riggs' time spent as the primary frontman for the Louisiana-born sludge metal icons Acid Bath is the stuff of metal legend, and pretty much everybody who's aware of metal as a genre beyond the most surface-level bands is aware of Acid Bath's extremely influential presence within the alternative and underground realms of sludge metal, stoner metal, while at the same time their incredibly tumultuous and brief existence that ultimately ended in tragedy with the death of their bassist in a car accident. But nonetheless, Dax Riggs, despite having most of his artistic legacy being rooted in that particular band and the 2 full-length projects that they put out before their recent reunion, actually put out quite a bit of very well-received solo stuff that I think doesn't really get discussed nearly enough. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not head over heels in love with the majority of his solo work in the same way that I am a record like, say, Acid Bath's When the Kite String Pops, but at the same time, the guy really carved himself out as a unique solo artist. I mean, he could have easily taken a step back from music after the demise of his original band, but instead he put out 2007's We Sing of Only Blood or Love that kind of saw him go in a more bluesy direction, all of these blues rock riffs and these stoner rock kind of vibes that felt reminiscent of the influences that he picked up on with his prior project, but at the same time entirely unique from anything that he had done before, and that continued to be true throughout the rest of his solo discography. And he even incorporated with his, Louisianan influences some CCR, John Fogerty-esque swamp rock kind of influences, with 2010's Say Goodnight to the World being the last time that Riggs was heard from as a solo artist on a full-length studio project. And now here we are a full decade and a half later with his latest full-length studio album, 7 Songs for Spiders, and despite coming well over a decade after his last full-length solo effort, it feels like he never left, and this feels like yet another step of evolution for Riggs' solo career, which is even more impressive when you consider the fact that he's currently rejoining Acid Bath and reuniting with them as well. It's just really nice to hear from him again in any regard, but especially when it's a record as solid as this one. Instrumentally speaking, this is a pretty phenomenal record overall. A lot of the aforementioned stoner rock and at times sort of heavy psychedelic rock influences are being put on display here, though I would argue that the semi-psychedelic influences I just mentioned are maybe a bit more in play here than we've ever seen before in his solo efforts. I mean, they've always been a bit of an omnipresent feature of the average solo Dax Riggs record, but at the same time, here on this album, everything just feels a little bit more dense, and all 7 tracks here really do carry on this consistent theme of sonic density that kind of allows the, again, psychedelic vibe of a lot of things to really feel enhanced overall. It makes for an imposing atmosphere that is at the same time pretty accessible for anyone who is easily able to approach more kind of stoner adjacent sort of heavy music, whether that's your average stoner rock or the heavier side of stoner metal. Either way, this is a record that feels pretty easily accessible for someone who can get into any of those relative sounds overall, and I think it's really nice to see him embrace just how trippy this record can be at times on songs like Ain't That Darkness, for example, really just feeling like the record's going all out on embracing the atmospheric qualities that Riggs has always pretty much brought to his solo career, but arguably never quite to the extent that he does here on 7 Songs for Spiders, and that is something that carries itself throughout the entire of the record's brief runtime, which is really nice to see. It feels like this record, despite coming at a very unique and at a point kind of almost comeback sort of era for Dax Riggs, also manages to feel like something totally new. Artists who spend a decade and a half working on another solo record or reunite with their old band and the remaining members, it often can feel like a artist just kind of going out of their way to rehash old sounds from their back catalog. Here on 7 Songs for Spiders, it feels like the opposite. It's Riggs coming back to his presence as a solo artist with just as much creativity, just as much ambition as he did in 2007, and just as much creativity and ambition that he had in 1997. It's just really nice to see the guy still willing to push his own boundaries as an artist and as a creative person, and it results in a record that feels unique in the context of his solo discography, which is really nice to see. in the midst of all of this sort of relatively minimalistic, but at the same time occasionally maximalist Southern Gothic energy and these influences from varying corners of Riggs's musical repertoire, is Riggs himself as a frontman, as a charismatic presence behind the mic, and I feel that that particular quality of the record is going to be a bit polarizing for some people due to the way that the album is produced. This is an album that is heavily focused on atmosphere, and that means that in some of the larger moments overall, it can kind of feel like Riggs's vocals are more of a scene-setting piece, and at times a background noise, rather than an up-in-front piece of the record. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, personally. I greatly enjoy his presence throughout the record. In the slower moments, he proves himself to be the fantastic vocalist that he always has been, no matter whether you're talking about one of his many bands, or if you're talking about his solo work, or in the larger and more explosive, more rock/metal-oriented moments, where he kind of, again, becomes a bit of a background noise, yet another layer to the walls of intensity and sound that are being provided to the listener. I think it works in those cases as well. I think that due to the nature of his vocal style and how well his vocals suit the kind of themes of this record, the ideas of death and mortality, and these at times extremely nuanced kind of takes on general psychedelic and otherworldly sort of topics, I think that in that sense, his vocals being buried by the production is an intentional choice, or at least comes across as an intentional choice, as a means of creating something that feels like a singular, swirling piece of music rather than something that's made up of varying different parts that were spliced together in post in the studio, which this easily could have felt like and been perfectly fine as is. But it really is nice to see this record manage to feel like it's something that is wholly singular in nature in terms of the manner in which it's recorded and how it feels for the listener to experience it on their own outside of the context of analyzing how it was recorded or why certain creative decisions were made, etc., etc. It's just a really strong record in the recording aspect of things in my eyes, and I can certainly see why some people wouldn't enjoy it, especially if you're a big enough Dax Riggs fan that you consider him to be the primary spotlight quality of every single record that he's involved with. But I just don't necessarily think that's true here. He's one of many great qualities of an album that's filled with talented instrumentalists and a fairly wide variety of tones and climaxes, which is nice to see from a record that doesn't even crack 30 minutes, and if it wasn't stated otherwise, I probably would have considered an EP. But overall, really, I think that instrumentally and vocally, this is a pretty phenomenal record through and through. Now, with that aforementioned brief runtime, I do have a slight issue, and it's honestly one that I've kind of had with most of Riggs' solo work. There's just not enough here for me to really enjoy it to the fullest extent that I would. I mean, this is a very good record, don't get me wrong. Everything that's here, I really don't have any particular qualms about on a musical level, nothing that I listen to and think, oh, I would have enjoyed this more if X, Y, or Z were done. But at the same time, it's only a little over 28 minutes, and I don't mind that, but I also do just kind of wish it had a bit more going for it. In a sense, maybe it's for the better that it's this short. That means it's all killer, no filler, and that's certainly not something I'm going to complain about. Oh no, the album didn't have any bad songs on it. But at the same time, by the time that Graveyard Soul wraps up and closes out the record, I'm just left kind of wishing that maybe there was another track or two somewhere in the middle, just to stretch this out to, 32 minutes, 35 minutes. Not necessarily just because there needs to be some more padding in the middle of the record, but because I feel like this is a record that has a lot of strong creative and artistic direction to it, and I feel like given a little bit more time, there could have been more songs developed that would have warranted their place on the record. And as a whole, I recognize that that is a small and, in a sense, kind of ridiculous nitpick, asking an artist to make more songs for a record that they personally feel is complete, and I mean, I can't really ask for more songs to just be developed out of thin air. That's not how creation works. I'm well aware of that. But at the same time, I just do feel like this record is not necessarily underwhelming in any musical sense, but it does end up being a bit underwhelming upon multiple re-listens, because every single time you come back to it, you come back wishing that there was just that much more to it. But as a whole, when your biggest complaint about a record was the fact that there just wasn't quite enough of the really strong, consistent, atmospheric Southern material that you really enjoy about a record, I feel like you don't really have that much to complain about, and that includes, me in that conversation. I will be 100% honest. I am severely afraid that this record is going to get overshadowed, and quite frankly, I think it already is. The Acid Bath reunion with Dax Riggs is something that people have been wanting and begging for a long time, ever since the band initially wrapped up decades ago, and as a whole, I can understand it completely. I love Acid Bath, easily one of the best metal bands of the 90s, I'm not arguing with anybody about that, but at the same time, I don't know, I wish that in the time that Acid Bath were not a thing, and seemingly were never going to reunite in any form whatsoever, understandably so considering the tragedy of their initial ending, that people focused on Riggs' solo work. I mean, sure, it isn't the exact same stylistically or sonically as Acid Bath. In fact, in a lot of ways, it seems to intentionally differentiate itself from his work in that era when he was just a teenager working on music. But at the same time, I still do think that there is a lot to enjoy here if you can appreciate in Acid Bath a lot of the more southern metal kind of influences, because at the end of the day, those are rooted in southern rock, swamp rock, blues rock, so on and so forth, genres of, general rock music and in turn eventually metal that developed heavily in the South. So if you appreciate those qualities of Riggs' past work and you haven't really taken the time to go out and visit his solo efforts, and even if this one doesn't seem that interesting to you, I implore you to go listen to other solo records he's put out in the past. They may not blow you away, but they are consistently good through and through, and the fact that the man has never really put out a particularly weak or unmemorable record all these years later, including this album, which is very good, albeit a bit too short, is nothing short of extremely impressive to me. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.